Okay, welcome to the Preschool Conference 2024. This is our second session with Chris Russell in supporting communication development and curriculum access for children with visual impairments and complex communication needs. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chris right now with his biography. Chris Russell is a special education teacher and teacher of students with visual impairments, currently working with New York City Department of Education's hospital schools, and has provided extensive training to educational teams and agencies as the project coordinator for the New York Deafblind Collaborative. Chris specializes in severe and multiple disabilities, including deafblindness, cortical vision impairment, curriculum adaptations for children with visual impairments and additional disabilities, and instructional strategies supporting communication development for children with pre-symbolic communication. He has the Perkins-Roman CVI range endorsement and conducts trainings for CVI characteristics, phases, assessments, and intervention across New York State and nationally for professionals and families. He is adjunct faculty at Hunter College, City University of New York, in the graduate programs for blindness, visual impairment, and childhood special education, severe multiple disabilities, and holds a master's degree in educational leadership from Queens College, City University of New York. Wow. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much. And I will let you take it on from here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you all, whether you're here in person or you're watching this as a recording. And I want to just say a big, huge thank you to Trisha for inviting me and to Dawn for inviting me and making this happen. So this is the part one of this two-part series. But the two parts really are separate in content. So it's okay if you're watching this in isolation and the second one in isolation, or together, they might complement themselves. The second session is going to be focused more intensively on curriculum adaptations, concept development, and functional routines. So it has a lot more to do with sort of the educational side of supporting students with visual impairments and complex communication needs. Today's session is focused on pre-symbolic and concrete communication development, and then strategies to work with kids who have visual impairments, complex communication needs, and are pre-symbolic communicators, meaning they're sort of on the pre-language level. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Always good when technology does work. Makes me very happy. So I'm just kind of going to take it away. You know, when I do in-person training, I make it like I'll ask a lot of questions and I'll try to get a lot of input and feedback and observations. Because we're virtual, I'll kind of just run through content, but I also will try to throw questions out for you as you watch this to sort of be asking yourself and reflecting on. I always say, maybe at my own peril, to please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is at the bottom right of the screen there, and it's also on the materials that you should have access to in the live binder that Trisha put together. Please feel free to reach out to me if questions come up, if you want, to clarify things or get even specific input on your students or your children from something that came up in this webinar. So if you've ever seen me present before or met me before, you know that I have way more content than we have time. And that doesn't matter if it's a day-long presentation or an hour-long presentation. I'm always going to overload you with content. And I do that deliberately because I want to have extension content for you. So I try to front load the material that I know we want to get to. And then you'll see in the slides, which you have access to as well, you'll see that sort of like towards the end of the slides, there's a whole lot extra content. We don't intend to get to that tonight. We're going to get through as much as we can, and the rest is kind of there for you as an extension. So let's just dig right into it. When we're talking about kids with visual impairments and kids with complex communication needs, it's really important to break down the specific impact of the visual impairments or visual impairment and the specific impact of any other sensory challenges or sensory differences that the student has. I like this image of sort of distant senses versus near senses as a way of just starting with a foundation of really thinking about how visual impairment, as well as hearing loss, is primarily a disability of access. And what's meant by that, it's specifically a disability of access to observation, access to what's called incidental learning or incidental information. Because what's missing, or what there's a deficit of, is access to information that occurs beyond arm's reach, beyond immediate contact. And we're going to look at how that affects the development of symbolism and language, especially for kids who have additional challenges on top of visual impairment, which is the majority of kids with visual impairment in today's population. So to think about this, distant senses are senses that you can access beyond your physical reach, beyond your immediate physical experience. And vision is the most important one for development in terms of being able to observe things happening around the world and around the child's reality. Most of that comes from vision, especially in early childhood learning. Some secondarily comes from hearing, and then of course from smell. But vision really is the primary sense that's used to observe. And the overwhelming majority of early concept development, how the world works, what things are, how people move through the world and interact with the objects in the world, primarily comes from observation from vision. So our second session in a few weeks from now is going to look at supporting concept development to compensate for lack of access or reduced access to that observation. But tonight we're going to think about how specifically that impacts communication development, and then strategies we can use to scaffold communication development and make up for that deficit in access to observation. It's also really important here to think about the near senses. The near senses are, for the majority of kids with visual impairments who have significant visual impairment, the near senses are a really important way that kids get information. And the near senses are not just tactile, right? The tactile sense is an obvious one, but also other things like vestibular sense, your sense of grounding in space, which is really centered in your inner ear, and your sense of gravity and positioning. And then the proprioceptive sense, which is anchored in your joints and gives you information about where your body is, where your body parts are in relation to each other. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next session as well, but think about how other ways that information is perceived. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about strategies to support communication development too. Okay. One thing I want to highlight is that all of the approaches that we use when we talk about kids with visual impairments and including those who have complex communication needs, there's a unique impact of that access or deficit in access depending on whether the child has a whole wide variety of ocular visual impairments that relate to the eyes themselves. And it's important to know what specific condition the child has and to understand that different conditions have different impacts, right? And I think that the teachers of students with visual impairments, the TVIs or TSVIs out there, you know this stuff. It's important for you guys as well to emphasize that with the families that you work with and with the other team members that you work with, how important it is to understand the unique impact of the unique condition. Like, for example, the impact of glaucoma is totally different from the impact of retinal detachment, and it's going to result in different ways that access to observation and to communication is going to be impacted too. So, we're not going to do a whole webinar tonight on the unique impact of each visual impairment, but I want to just emphasize how important it is to have a good functional vision assessment for a student who has residual vision, understand what the impact is on things like acuity loss, visual field loss, whether it's central or peripheral, how significant is it? Is it progressive or stable? The impact of ocular motor conditions on things like depth perception, on blurring of vision, on fatigue, visual fatigue even. And then all of those ocular visual impairments, which themselves are each unique, are totally different from cortical or neurological forms of visual impairment. And I know that in Wisconsin, you've had some training, you've had some webinars in past conferences on CVI, cortical visual impairment, as well as on the broader umbrella category of neurological or cerebral visual impairments. I think the most important thing to focus on in today's content is just the understanding that what we're doing to support these kids from a visual perspective and from an access perspective looks very different if it's an ocular visual impairment or a cortical or neurological visual impairment. And just briefly, CVI, cortical visual impairment, if your child or your students have CVI, is totally different from ocular forms of visual impairment in that the impact is not in the eye, right? And so it doesn't result in things like visual acuity loss or field loss. You might be thinking, oh, but isn't visual field preferences a unique characteristic of CVI? Yes, it's exactly that. It's visual field preferences, not a loss or a cut in visual field. Kids with CVI tend to have preferred visual fields or visual fields that are easier for them, like peripheral fields. But that's not a total loss of those visual fields. So kids with CVI have unique visual behaviors and characteristics, and we're not going to do a whole deep dive into that, but just to say it's important to understand that impact uniquely. And one of the most unique things about CVI that makes it very different from ocular forms of visual impairment is that for kids who have CVI, specific interventions that we are using with these kids and ways of adapting materials are actually intended to improve their vision over time. If you think about that, a child with an ocular form of visual impairment where there's damage to the structure of the eye, or the deficit or difficulty is based in something that's going on with the eyes, we're not expecting that vision will improve over time, but rather we're teaching those children compensatory skills to compensate for the fact that they have a visual impairment and succeed in their endeavors and access information in spite of that visual impairment, but not to improve it over time. Well, with CVI, it's the opposite. We're actually working to improve vision over time through giving the child practice using their vision in meaningful ways, and the visual processing centers of the brain are continuing to develop and improve, right? So it's quite different approach. It's based on assessment, and we really need to have a good assessment for any child. But in terms of CVI, we're using different approaches depending on where the child falls on this range of visual functioning. And what I like to say as the TVI, and I found that this is a good sort of tagline for you TVIs out there, and maybe also for families too, that everyone on the team really needs to get on board with these interventions, because you can't make progress neurologically in like a 30-minute session twice a week with that student, with that child. It has to be practiced and integrated throughout their school day and throughout their life, and with shared practices and interventions that go back and forth between school and home. So that's one way I like to sort of explain it to teams working with kids with CVI, how important the collaborative effort is, because we're working in these cases on literally neurological progress and the improvement of visual functioning. Okay. Of course, feel free, if anybody is live, feel free to chime in and ask questions, but otherwise, you can ask questions, if you're watching this as a recording, you can feel free to email me too with any questions. One of the resources that you have in your live binder is a 2-page fact sheet on CVI. This is for today's purpose. This is a substitute for like a very long tangent that I would take you on and would distract me from what I'm supposed to be talking about. So this is just sort of shared language around CVI, what's unique about it, answers to some frequently asked questions, and links to additional resources. Okay. That was all I was really going to do on CVI, other than to say that CVI is the largest cause of childhood visual impairment in the US. And the most recent and really the largest data that we have on kids with CVI to date, in a recent study, there was a huge survey of alternate assessment data from the dynamic learning maps out of Kansas. They did a nationwide study though, and they gathered information on something like, I think it was like 2,000 kids or something like that. They did find definitively that amongst kids with CVI, as opposed to kids who didn't have CVI, were a higher percentage of AAC, augmentative and alternative communication users, and a higher percentage of students with complex healthcare needs. There's also some other interesting data in there too, like a lower percentage of identified hearing loss, but a higher percentage of unknown hearing loss as compared to kids without CVI. My guess with that one is probably that kids with CVI are more likely to have an auditory processing disorder, which is much more difficult to diagnose. Okay, so that's really all I was going to do on on CVI or on the difference between ocular and CVI. The rest is sort of a separate presentation. I wanted to get right into communication development and unique aspects of communication development for kids with visual impairment and complex needs. The first question I think you want to ask about your student or your child in terms of their communication development is, do they have the milestone of symbolism? Do they have symbolic expression? And what that means is, do they have the understanding that a symbol can be used to refer to an event, activity, object, person? In order to have symbolism, and then not just do they understand that receptively, but are they able to use symbols expressively? Now, symbols can be a lot of different things, but in order to have symbolism, you have to have a symbol, which is not the object itself. It's a symbol that represents the object. So let's use, for example, this would be like a tangible symbol, a concrete symbol, a bottle cap, right? The bottle cap is going to be used as a symbol for what it refers to, the referent, which is water, or maybe specifically a water bottle. So we have the symbol, and then we have the thing that the symbol refers to. And the power of symbolism, and the reason that symbolism is so important and such a major milestone in early communication development, is that if you have symbolism and you can use a symbol to communicate about something that is being referred to, about the referent, you have dramatically expanded the reach of what you're able to communicate about. If you don't have symbolism, you can't communicate about things that you're not in immediate contact with. If I know that this water bottle cap can be used to refer to the water bottle, it doesn't even matter if the water bottle is within my view or my reach, or even in the same room, or even in the same building. I can communicate about something that's outside of my immediate experience. And symbolism is the important precursor in communication development to first words and language. Okay, so we have to have a symbol and a referent. Object communication, communicating by, choosing between two objects. Do you want the glass of water or do you want the bottle of water? That's not symbolic communication. That's just communicating about objects that are in our immediate environment. Symbolic communication allows us to communicate about something that's not in our direct reach or in our immediate view. And this is a very difficult one, and one that kids with visual impairments, and especially those who have additional developmental challenges, struggle to meet this important milestone. Why? Precisely because the distance between a symbol and the thing that it refers to can be infinite if you don't have access to observation, right? The process of developing symbolism in the theory of symbolism, theoretical construct of symbolism, is actually called distancing. And that refers to the amount of distance in time and in space between the symbol and the thing that it refers to. And the further away we can build that distance, the stronger our sense of symbolism is. But a lot of our kids can only communicate about things that they're in immediate contact with, which means there's no distance between the symbol and the referent. Okay, so if that seems a little abstract, let's dig in a little deeper. Within symbolism, so I've got my water bottle cap, right? That's a symbol. Within symbolism, there's something called iconicity, which is a scale or a range of how concrete a symbol is in connection to the thing it refers to, in connection to its referent. Concrete means that the symbol bears a strong resemblance to the thing that it refers to. And that resemblance can either be visual, if I have vision, or it can be tactile, if that's my main sense, or it could even be auditory, if that's the way that I experience something. But the symbol is concrete if it bears a strong resemblance to the thing that it refers to. It's easy to make that connection. So the most concrete type of symbol is called an icon. It's something that bears a very strong resemblance to what it refers to. A photograph of the water bottle bears a strong resemblance to the water bottle itself. Or maybe for one student, this cap of the water bottle feels just like when I interact tactily with the water bottle. So that's an icon. It's very concrete. The next level of abstractness is called an index, and this one probably looks familiar to you if you've ever been in any special education classroom around the country. This is a board maker, or PEX, picture exchange communication symbol, and it's basically a line drawing that's used to represent water. And this really came out of the field of autism. It's really not based on the field of communication development for kids with visual impairments or deaf blindness or multiple disabilities. And if you think about it, an index, like the picture in front of you, the board maker symbol in front of you, an index has some resemblance to what it refers to, but not a direct concrete resemblance. It actually requires some background connections, some thinking and some connections from your experiences, so that you're able to look at this simple line drawing and go, oh, you know, that weird little gray shape there, that is like a side view of a faucet with that particular type of twisty, handle on the top. And I've seen things that look like that before, and I know I can recognize that that's a faucet, even though it's a very abstract drawing of a faucet. And then those lines that are coming out from under it that are colored in blue, and the wavy lines, that's supposed to be water, even though really that doesn't bear a strong resemblance to water, or certainly not to the experience of water, of drinking water, or of washing your hands in water, or it doesn't feel or really look like that experience. So that's an index. It requires some background information, but there are some clues there. And if you can put the clues together, you can figure out, right, that's water. Then there is the most abstract symbol, and that's what's called a true symbol or an abstract symbol. And the one on the right there is a very abstract symbol. If you haven't figured it out yet, that's a model of the molecular structure of water, right? The large oxygen molecule and the two little hydrogen molecules, right? So that's very abstract. I'm sure that we would all agree that we would never choose that as a communication symbol for our child or one of our students who is developing communication. But how often do we choose the one in the middle? And we take it for granted that really that one in the middle is every bit as abstract as the one on the right for somebody who doesn't have that background connection and the experiences to make those rather complex associations. So I'm not saying that an index or the board maker symbols are never okay. I've seen plenty of kids, as I'm sure many of you have, for whom that's totally an appropriate symbol. But I think it's a very common mistake that's made, and it's a very common jump that's made for a lot of our students to use an index when in fact the student needs an icon. They need something more concrete, more connected to the direct association with the experience or the referent, right? So I just ask you to sort of think about that. Next time you see an index being used, something abstract being used, think, is this really too abstract for my student? Do I need to take a step back and use something more concrete and an icon? And I really do believe that this is the most common example of when I've seen a child stagnate and not make progress towards symbolism because we were skipping over the icon and going straight to an index. Okay. So another question to think about is for these students, for the children that your child or your student who has a visual impairment and complex communication needs, our kids have significantly reduced access to experiences and exposure to a wide variety of experiences because of that reduced observation, that reduced amount of incidental information. So we also have to ask, when choosing a symbol, is that a symbol that makes sense for that child's personal experience? So, is this the child's experience with water, drinking from a water bottle? Or maybe it would be more appropriate to have an image or a symbol built out of their personal water bottle, like a personal canteen. Or maybe it's a specific cup that they always use. Or maybe there's a different symbol for drinking from the water fountain because that's such a unique experience. So in choosing symbols, we also have to think about how this idea of iconicity, concrete to abstract, in the choice of symbols that we use, is very relative to individual experience, especially for kids who have reduced experiences. Okay, so I have lots of resources for you, and a lot of the stuff you can look through on Live Binders kind of gives you some of the background here in case you are like copiously taking notes or taking screenshots. You don't have to, it's all there for you. We're going to talk through some modes of communication. In particular, we're going to talk through the pre-symbolic and concrete modes. But this is just to say that, modalities or forms, ways of communicating can really be split into pre-symbolic modes and symbolic modes. Pre-symbolic modes are ways of communicating that don't require symbolism, whereas symbolic modes are ways that you can really only use effectively if you have that milestone of symbolism. So we're going to especially talk about these pre-symbolic modes as ways of building up and scaffolding and bridging a student's communication development when they don't yet have symbolism. Once you have symbolism, you're on into more complex language systems, right? And some of that really, I think, maybe speaks for itself. Okay, so what I want to do is get into communication development. And I think, we need really about maybe 35 minutes to go through early communication development and think about what that looks like and recognizing a student's communication behaviors on a pre-symbolic level, on a pre-language level. When we look at communication development, on the early level, on the pre-language level, we can break down the reasons for communicating or the functions of communication into 4 primary functions. There's 4 major early reasons to communicate. Once you have language, those 4 reasons actually expand into, 25, 35, 50 different sub-reasons in each one of these early functions. But up until language, these are really the 4 primary functions. And they are 1, to refuse or reject things that you don't want, or on the earliest level, just to protest or express discomfort. There's requesting and obtaining things that you do want, or on the earliest levels, expressing comfort. There's social interaction, right? Communication solely for the purpose of connecting with others, including on the earliest levels of showing affection, requesting attention, not to get something, but just to connect with another person. And then seeking or providing information is the 4th one, which on more advanced levels of communication leads to things like questioning, clarifying, analyzing, and all of these higher order forms of communication. But they all start with one of these 4. And there are 7 major stages or levels of communication development that lead up towards language being the 7th one. Today, we're going to look at these first 4. We're going to look at these first 4. And then we're going to dig into that 5th one, concrete symbols, which is really more of a bridge between the first 4 and abstract symbols and language. So I want to just walk you through each one of these early stages of communication and think about what it looks like and perhaps the impact of visual impairment and additional disabilities on these early forms of communication. And these are all expressive communication, meaning communication that goes outward, from the child, rather than receptive, what they understand, right? So at the earliest level of communication development, we're looking at pre-intentional behaviors. Another way to describe pre-intentional behaviors is reflexes. Pre-intentional behaviors are basically reflexive responses to stimulus. Okay, the student feels a certain way or feels an input or a stimulus of some kind and reacts or responds apparently randomly, apparently out of their control, apparently reflexive. And I emphasize the word apparently because we don't really know, right? We don't really know 100%. Is the student aware of this? Was this intentional? As we're going to see, some of the reflexes are definitely reflexes, and some of them could be reflexes or they could be behaviors that the student is doing intentionally. So we're interpreting that, and that's really the biggest characteristic, I think, of learners who communicate at this early level is that their behaviors require a lot of observation and a lot of interpretation by responsive caregivers and teachers who are watching and are thinking, oh, is that random? Is it not random? Well, even if it is random, it means something. And we're teaching this child over time that even their reflexes can be used to communicate things to people who they interact with and who interact with them. So I'll give you some examples. Pre-intentional behaviors or reflexive behaviors can be things like changing in posture, stiffening of the body, turning away, arching of the back. All of those, I think about the example of a child who's in an adaptive chair or Riften chair and is, has either high or low muscle tone from cerebral palsy and other physical stuff that they deal with. And the child, when they feel uncomfortable, they may arch their shoulders, they may clench their hands or, arch their wrists together. You may see increased contractions, increased tension. You may also see arching of the back. You might see a facial expression go with that, a vocalization, even a change in respiration, flesh tone, body temperature, heart rate even. You might also see some kicking or batting of limbs, right? Or some head movements, some shaking or trembling, right? And that tells you something. It tells you that the child is uncomfortable. But then it's up to you to decide, well, why are they uncomfortable? Is it because they just need to be readjusted in their chair? They're hungry, they're tired, they have internal pain, whole wide variety of things, right? Even reflexive pre-intentional behaviors can be broken down into functions. Refusal at the earliest form is just expressing discomfort. Obtaining or requesting is just expressing comfort. So when the child was clenched and tight and looked uncomfortable and upset, and someone came over and talked to them and gave them a light touch on their shoulder and said, I see you're not comfortable, I'm going to help you move in your chair, and the child relaxed their arched back, let go of, or at least tried to let go of their their tight muscle tone, maybe released the tight facial expression, maybe stopped the cooing or vocalizing. That would be an early form of requesting. Early form of socialization might be expressing comfort or interest or orientation toward maybe specific people. And if you notice, the fourth function of communication, seeking or providing information, is actually left out here, because you can't seek or provide information until you have at least conventional communication, which we're going to get to in a little bit. So at the earliest stages, we're just looking at these first three forms or functions. I want to show you a short little video that I think is a nice example of a child who is doing a lot of reflexive or pre-intentional communication. And when I show this, I like to ask you to just see how many behaviors you can observe, how many things are observable to you, and try really hard to get yourself out of the habit of trying to interpret what does it mean or what is she trying to tell us. Instead, just start by watching and stating, what do you see happening? Totally objectively. She's doing this, she's doing this. Not, oh, she's doing this because this, that, and the other. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you. It's a 45-second long video. I'm not going to say anything. And then I'm going to play it again slowly and walk through all the things that are happening. So the first time, just try to only observe. And the only quick context that I'll give you is that this is a little girl who has CVI, cortical visual impairment, also has clearly has some increased muscle tone, and also has she also has a hearing loss too. And the teacher is repositioning her from, I think she was like laying down, repositioning her on her knee to sort of like an assisted standing to support like an assisted walking out of the room. So it's a transition between activities. And it's very obvious that the student is stressed and uncomfortable.
We're going to stand up. Let's walk.
Okay, so that gave you some time to do some observation, and let's see how many things we can come up with, okay? Pre-intentional behaviors, reflexive behaviors. We've got arching of the back. We're going to try to be as objective as possible. Arching of the back, sort of flailing or kicking of, well, batting of arms and limbs. We've got facial expression, vocalization. Here now we've got tightening and clenching of hands, even like try to be like as clear as possible in my descriptions. Locking fingers together in a tight kind of way. Again, we got arching of the neck and back. kind of these loose batting arm movements. And then we have a different type of reflexive behavior where suddenly that shifted right around here, and it shifted to relaxed shoulders, relaxed back, relaxed neck, relaxed facial expressions, relaxed limbs. And this was the only moment where I think we caught a definite intentional behavior, which we're coming to next, of gripping onto the teacher's hand and even looking at it. The only moment in the video where we actually see visual connection, looking. But whatever it was like still too much to deal with. And so we go right back to those earlier behaviors that we observed, right? I think I see Trisha raised your hand. Yeah, go for
Hi,
it.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So that was really apparent in the video and pretty powerful. So I'm wondering, does this normally start taking place with others involved? The calming and the intentional, or
well, that's
is it also on their own?
That's a really good question, because it depends on what's the stimulus that caused it, right? So did you get a sense of, or even anyone else on the call too, did anyone get a sense of why she made that shift? I think we can tell most of all these behaviors would fall into the category of refusal or discomfort, but what caused that shift?
I know there's a hand under hand opportunity for touch with the person that she's working with.
Absolutely. I really think that that's what it is, right? And so, the student is uncomfortable, and then we see a shift, and the shift happens when she feels like she has a stable support, and maybe whatever it was that was stressing her out and making her overwhelmed stops. And it still wasn't quite enough, but yeah, go ahead.
So is that something that's really important to note and to expand upon then from that one moment?
Definitely. I mean, I think this is like such a powerful example of how just providing a little bit of wait time and stability can actually shift this very stressful transition, even briefly, to like more of a connected and calm transition where the student feels stable. I'm also thinking a couple things. One, a student who has differences in muscle tone, she may have like some low muscle tone and some contracted muscle tone. She's going to have some vestibular issues, right? So she probably like sitting on the teacher's knee, and during this like strange physical transition, she probably feels like really out of her element and unstable physically. So it's very possible that even just that physical shift is what was so stressful for her. And then when that was slowed down a little bit and there was a little more stability, it was not as overstimulating. The other thing I noticed after watching this video like 100 times, I don't think I noticed it the first 100 times, was that this whole time I'm watching the teacher's right hand, right? I'm going, oh, that's really nice, like hand under hand. But I don't think that's what caused her to be calm. I think it's actually the teacher's left hand right there.
Oh, yeah, I totally missed that.
Right? And I think that the stability and the calming only happens when she's stable on both sides. Because it was like, oh, okay, all right, I'm good. And then there's still a little delay, a little processing delay. But that's when she kind of clicks into place after having that support from both hands. And that's where she grips both of the teacher's hands.
Okay, a sense of security from both sides.
Security, yeah. This moment here is like a really cool moment. And especially for a student with CVI, who's dealing with all this multisensory complexity, the fact that that's the only moment where we see her using her vision, to me, that's like a poster child for, positioning is so important for kids who deal with multisensory complexity. Stability of positioning actually improves the ability to use vision.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you asked that. I'm going to try to ask you guys more questions too, even though there's just a few people on in person, because I feel like that's the kind of interaction that I like to have to draw this content out. The only other thing I was going to say about this is that, this is a 45-second long video. 45 seconds probably feels like no time at all, right? 45 seconds goes by like nothing, but she could probably have even extended. This was a great example of a teacher being responsive to a student, but she could probably even extend that to like a 5-minute period. What if we just kind of sat and slowly processed the physical transition over 5 minutes? Could we wait to get her completely calm before just going ahead with it? Or should we? I really don't feel like kids are learning or engaged when they're stressed. And so what's happening in this transition other than just to get her from one place to the next if she's still stressed while we keep moving ahead? So I don't know, there's a lot there. Right, so let me see, I want to there's like a whole bunch of other stuff here that I think, yeah, we talked a little bit about positioning, but I want to get to some of this other rich content for you guys as well. So just in terms of positioning off the back of that video, I think it's really important that we plan positioning clearly to maximize any residual use of vision that a student does have. And I think especially for the kids who are early communicators, it makes a very big difference in terms of what they can access incidentally and what they can then communicate outward to us. So, something simple like this. This was just a little chart I put together a few years ago to just help teams plan positioning and how that might look different throughout the day for a student with a visual impairment. The idea is, obviously with the PT and probably the OT and maybe even the O&M instructor, in some cases support, you would look at the whole day, like every activity that happens throughout the day, and you would think about what position do you want the student to be in during that activity, what additional physical adaptive equipment is needed, what extra accommodations are needed, like slant boards, presentation of materials, and then what physical assistance provided by the teachers needed. Yeah, Trisha.
Okay, hi, I'm sorry. I do like to ask questions.
I love it.
So I'm really jumping into a lot of the learning with the the deafblind, and I'm wondering if positioning, if that's also a factor with the auditory cues and sounds.
That's
like it is vision.
That's a good question. I really do think it is. I think positioning is important for all of us. Like, if you think about it, I think that your engagement is with anything and your ability to communicate effectively and to listen is very impacted by your positioning and your comfort, right? And I feel like I move around a lot. Like I need to like tuck my leg underneath my other leg or cross my knees or like, I need to move. I need to like stretch. I need to move around. We all have positioning needs, right? It's just that our kids' positioning needs are more significant often throughout the day, and there are more additional adaptations. And I think especially like these kids who are in Riften chairs all day and adaptive seating all day, I think it impacts them dramatically. I think it causes a lot of fatigue if kids don't move around a lot. And I think it probably causes a lot of discomfort too, to not have movement throughout the day. But in terms of auditory access, I mean, for kids, certainly for kids with hearing loss, positioning is impactful. And for kids who are deafblind, positioning is impactful. But I think for a lot of those kids, we also have to think even broader about like environmental features in the room, background noise, quality of sound in the room too, But yeah, that's super interesting. There's actually, I could probably send along some materials on that too. I think I have some good ones on like environmental adaptations for kids with hearing loss.
Thank you.
and deafblindness especially. Yeah. So all of that pre-intentional content is all sort of in the context of the goal of building intentionality, right? Intentionality is the first major milestone before symbolism. So pre-intentional, the student doesn't know that they're doing it, or it's not being done deliberately, or it's not within their control. Intentionality implies deliberate communication, deliberate behaviors at least. And I like this quote too: deliberate pursuit of a goal as well as the means to obtain that, right? There's two different levels of intentional communication. The first one is intentional behaviors. The second one is unconventional communication. And the difference in those are behavior is not directed at a person, right? So behavior can be intentional, but it's not directed at another person and it doesn't involve another person. Whereas communication involves a communication partner. There has to be a person involved to receive that intentional behavior. So the first stage here that we're talking about, intentional behaviors or purposeful actions, the child knows that they're doing it. It serves a function. That function may or may not be known to the child, but it's not directed at another person. So these are things like moving toward or away from an item, taking something you want, throwing or dropping something you don't want, intentional expressions and gestures, even self-injurious behaviors and sensory-seeking behaviors are intentional, right? They do serve a purpose. That purpose may or may not be distracting or harmful or maladaptive, but they do serve a purpose. The question is their purpose to communicate with others, or is it more an internally driven behavior rather than a communicative behavior? I think the classic example of this that I've seen is, I had a student way back when I was a classroom teacher who, when she was done with her lunch, she would just like throw it off the table. And it wasn't directed at a person. It was just like, I'm done with that. I don't want it, right? And the only thing standing in the way of that becoming communication was how I responded to it as the communication partner. Right? The student can take something or drop something. That's not communicative until I get involved. So kids who are at this intentional behavior level, the only thing missing is a person to communicate with. So the biggest tip here is just to get in the way. When the student throws their stuff on the floor that they don't want, get in the way of that, pick it back up and put it on their table and show them maybe together, hand under hand, together we can go and throw this away or push it away, right? Same thing with taking an object that you want. A student can go, find a toy that they want, pick it up and take it back to their space. But there was no communication in that interaction. It was just taking something that they want. The only thing missing is the communication partner. So if you can actually move the toy out of reach and then kind of stand in the way and be ready to communicate about it, to model the communication to requests, that's how to move intentional behaviors forward to communication. Trisha, yeah.
So what you're saying, when there's behaviors that most people just kind of stand out of the way because they're waiting for the behavior to be done, and they don't want to feed it, is what a lot of times they say.
Yeah.
We want to do the opposite by getting involved, getting in the way, and try to show them the correct way to handle whatever they're doing.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
Okay. Exactly. And I would say, like, even more specifically with what to do about it, what we're really hoping for is to model the communication that we're looking for. So, for example,
thank you.
Yeah, that's totally it, right? So, I had the same thing. I had the same student. She would go up at lunchtime, like on the dot at 11:30 every day. She would go to her cubby and pick up and grab her her like Pediasure that she drank for lunch out of her locker and bring it back to her chair and put it down on the table and sit down. And then she was just waiting for somebody to pour it for her. And so everyone thought like, wow, great, she can do that independent. That's an independent skill. But I was looking at it from the perspective of, well, great, she can do that, but she's not communicating with anybody about that. She can do that, but she can't request when she wants a drink. So I would actually put it up a little higher. I'd put it up above the shelf where she could still see it, but she couldn't reach it. And then I would go right at around 11:25 every day. I would go stand over there and just wait for her to come over. And the first month, I acquired some new scars because she was really upset that she couldn't reach it. And I was right there and I was the one responsible for that. So I got scratched and everything. But what I was trying to do was eventually sort of say like, no, you can get it. It's not that I'm taking it away from you. Together, we're gonna request it, and then I'm gonna give it to you. We'll request it with a tangible symbol, which I'll show you in a little bit. But we're creating communication opportunities out of these intentional behaviors, and then modeling the communication that we're looking for to build up their communication development. Another thing I would do is like I had a student who did like a lot of hand flapping when he was excited, and he would like hand flap and rock back and forth, and everyone just thought, well, that's just an isolated behavior. He's just over there, quote unquote stimming. And I saw it as, well, he's happy, like he's excited. That's his expression when he's happy and excited, and I know that because I know him pretty well. So I'm gonna go over and sit next to him and show him that I get it. And I would sit next to him and everyone thought I was crazy, but I would be like hand flapping and rocking too with him, but in a way that he could visually or tactily access. He needed like hand under hand to show him, oh yeah, me too, I'm happy as well. And he thought it was hilarious that and interesting to him that I also was like doing that same behavior. And I really do feel that it was able over time to be shifted into him understanding that his behavior wasn't just a behavior, it was communicating something to me about how he felt. And then the long-term goal, again, is just to shape it into something that is more conventional. You can communicate that in other ways too. So that's the idea, is shaping behaviors into communication. And that next stage is behaviors that are communicative, but they're not easily recognizable, right? They're unconventional. And this is a really important stage that I think a lot of our kids get stuck in. And because of that iconicity issue that I talked about earlier, I think a lot of our kids, this is their most common form of communication, is unconventional communication. These are behaviors that are directed at a person, but they're not easily recognizable. So these are things like pulling someone's hand or clothing, vocalizing toward a person, directing facial expressions towards people, approaching a person, leaning against a person even, reaching for something or someone, arm movements, head movements, leg movements, all of that stuff. We know that the student's communicating. And this is where you find yourself saying, like, I know you're trying to tell me something. What are you trying to tell me? And I think we've all heard ourselves say that. What is it that you're asking for? I know that you're asking for something. What is it that you're asking for? And again, I'm going to show you a video and let's see, same thing. Don't try to interpret what is she asking for, but try to just watch and observe what are all of the behaviors that you see. And then we can figure out what we think they mean. And this is another student with a visual impairment. She has low vision. I think she has like a coloboma on one eye and maybe blind in the other eye. And let's just see, it's about a minute 40. I'll play like a minute and a half.
wants to hold on to me. I'm here. You want to go try to get the water to work? I think you might like it. I'm here, I'm here. What? What? What did you say? What did you say? What? Trying to push it? I don't know. What? You want to push it? Let's see. She pushes it. Is that what you want?
Okay, so pause there. So what do you guys think? What were some behaviors that you observed?
Trying to get the attention of the other person to help.
Mm-hmm.
Dawn has her hand up.
Dawn, yeah, what were some specific ones that you saw?
Yeah, just it really seemed like she not only grabbed the hand of the person, but then she moved her body backwards, almost like I'm seeking movement or motion. It was the hand, but it also seemed to be her body motion moving backwards.
Yeah. So like pulling on the hand of the teacher, pulling on the shirt of the teacher, but then also like really pulling like her whole body like backwards. And then at some point, even pulling, she's like really trying to pull her body towards that chair, right? Towards that Riften chair. What else? Any other behaviors that you observed? Think just like totally objectively, simple things like what is the student doing physically? Like, for example, vocalizations. So she's pulling hand, pulling clothing, pulling whole body backwards, pulling towards the object, vocalizing.
She's lifting her chin up to try to establish some kind of a visual connection. I don't know how much vision she has.
Definitely. She's definitely looking up at the teacher.
Definitely heard vocalizations.
Definitely vocalization.
Not immediately, but a little later, almost like a secondary, like, hey, I've been trying to show you with my hands and my body movement. Now let me add something else that I'll communicate.
Totally. It's like, why aren't you getting what I'm trying to tell you? And there's a vocalization that I would be super interested for those who know this student. Like, is that a vocalization that means like, come on, like I'm trying to tell you? Is that like a frustrated vocalization, or is that like, like, how like families especially can almost always tell you like, what do these various vocalizations mean if there are different ones? So that's pretty interesting. There's also probably facial expressions that she's making that go with it too. Can anybody guess what would be like my first recommendation for this teacher? Is there anything you would recommend for this teacher?
I'd say she doesn't have to yell so loud. The student has visual impairment. I mean, unless the student also has some deafness to her.
And I would think that the teacher should be at the child's level.
Totally. Yeah, that is my number one. Definitely. I think, like the vocal response of like, what are you trying to tell me? What? Like, that's almost like our own thought process when we're experiencing I think it's like exactly what happens in unconventional communication. We're like, oh, I know she's trying to tell me something. What are you trying to tell me? What do you want to do? But I think that it's easy for us to say watching this video from this angle and with the luxury of the distance from it. But I think she would have been able to observe and figure out that communication so much quicker and much more effectively if she was down at the student's level. First thing I always do when I meet a student and have an interaction with a student is I get right down to their level, wherever their level is, even if it's laying down on the ground. That's where I'm going. Because I really don't think we can have reciprocal interactions with anyone when we're not at their level. You ever find that when you're like, you encounter somebody who's sitting down and you're standing up, it feels a little awkward, like looking down at someone who's sitting and you're like, hey, can I grab a chair too and come sit next to you? Because if we're not on the same level, we're not having a reciprocal interaction. And I think that if she got down to her level from the beginning, just down on her knees or crouch, she would actually have an easier time figuring out what the student's asking for. From our perspective, we can see that the student looks like she's asking to push that chair, right? Which would be easier to do if you're physically down with her. One curious thing here is that the teacher, when she was talking aloud, she was actually running through her head. I know it's a request. Okay. Unconventional communication is usually pretty easy to guess the function of. Very clear the student is requesting something. But then the teacher's running through her head, what are all the things that this student likes to request? And at one point she says, do you want to go play with the water? I don't know what she's asking me. Do you want to go say hi to someone? Like, she's running through her head, what are the things that we know the student likes and might be requesting? But the answer was right in the gesture. It was pulling her body towards that. Okay, so it's only by like observing those close pieces that we can really, drawing out the behaviors that we can actually figure out, well, how to interpret it. Yeah, Dawn.
I also wondered if the student has usable vision. Hearing, I'm sorry. There was music happening and it almost seemed like, could it have been a circle time? And I guess my thought was, if the student does like music, perhaps they dance with like a parent or a grandparent, and there might be more behind what's going on in the background than we might realize.
Totally. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I totally agree. There's always like, and this student, I think, definitely had at least some access to what's happening in the background. So, yeah, I think it's only when we slow ourselves down a minute and think about how busy a typical school day is. And this again is, the other video was 45 seconds. This is only a minute and a half, but there's so much going on and there could be a lot of things that the student is processing about what's happening. And if you don't have a conventional way to communicate, a lot of that is lost, right, without the context. But yeah, that's a really good point. So, so unconventional also can be broken down into function. Refusing can be pushing away an object or person, obtaining, reaching toward an object or person. And then from here, we can break down obtaining into even more functions, like making choices, requesting more of something that's happening, an object or an action. The hard one to do unconventionally is requesting a new object or action. If you're already playing a game or doing, involved in an activity and you pause it, it's actually quite easy to first focus on teaching a student or modeling for a student, requesting more to start again. But it's very hard to communicate about an object or action that isn't yet happening or isn't yet present if you can't do that symbolically with a symbol. Social can be looking at or touching a person, smiling, and you can break that down into requesting attention or showing affection. So conventional, by contrast, is using gestures that are not yet formal or abstract words or symbols, but they are generally understood by people. They're directed at a person and they're interactive, right? So they're easy to understand because they're part of our societal conventions that everyone uses. So things like pointing, which of course is difficult to do with a visual impairment because pointing always refers to directing your position towards something that is not directly in contact with you. So that's a hard one. Not impossible. You can teach pointing in many ways through vibration, sound, move or orient your body towards the sound, and so on. Shaking your head yes and no, looking back and forth between a person and a wanted item. I would argue that in that video, she's almost doing that, right? She's trying to pull the teacher over towards the thing that she wants. Almost conventional. Waving high and by. These last two I really like as early conventional gestures because they can easily be shaped into signs like want. Holding your hand out flat with your palms up to obtain can easily be shaped into want. Holding your hand out vertically with palms out to refuse or push something away can easily be shaped into finished or don't want or don't like or something like that. So just a really short video. This is a little girl showing a very early, I think her first conventional gesture, and she actually does have CVI as well. And you can tell pretty easily in this short video what she's asking for.
Ready? Shall I wipe your chin? Is it feeling sticky? I'll wipe your chin. First your hand. Yeah. And then your chin.
So it's not exactly that she's trying to wipe it herself. She's communicating to the other person to wipe it. It's actually similar to the sign for dry. But can anybody guess, like, how do you think that she developed that sign or that gesture, that conventional gesture?
Mom, just out of routine of being,
Yeah, maybe
copying.
Copying. If she does have CVI. She definitely has, significantly reduced access to information. So for sure, she didn't get it by visual imitation. So if we know she didn't get it by visual imitation, what do you think? I think I saw someone raise their hand, but then it disappeared.
I did, because when you wipe your mouth, you're going to go across like that. So that feeling of wiping the mouth to clean it.
Yeah, April, through the actual physical experience or action of wiping her mouth, right? I'm thinking that specifically it's the experience of hand under hand wiping her mouth, right? Because if somebody's just doing it for her, she's not going to get that gesture of her doing it herself. If someone is taking her hand over hand and physically doing it, she's also not going to get it because that's sort of a restrictive wiping. But if someone is modeling the movement for her, she could actually get the gesture. And there's something that's an amazing idea that there's some interesting research on in the field of deafblindness called bodily emotional traces. Bodily emotional traces are gestures that can develop out of physical experiences that are repeated over time. And the example that they give in a lot of the articles and research about it is that, a child goes and plays on the playground at school and is on the swing and has a great time, and, it's a memorable experience. But that child doesn't have language. So when the child gets home from school and mom says, how was school today? And the student, can't express that linguistically, but the child makes a hand gesture like this and rocks back and forth. And unless somebody lets the mom know, we went on the swing today and your child loved it, the mom might not pick up that that's actually a gesture that the child's using that's a bodily emotional trace. She's got the actual feeling of the experience in her body, and she's able to use that feeling and that exact movement to refer to the experience that she had. And I think that's not too dissimilar from the way that we can learn conventional gestures. Students with visual impairments can learn conventional gestures. We talked through sort of like from stage to stage, how what you would do to support a student who was at that level. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to carry forward, but feel free to jump in too. It's important to emphasize that the goals are not just to increase the level of communication. It's not just, to to go from pre-intentional to intentional and so on. It's also to increase the amount of different functions of communication, right? Refuse, request, socialize, seek and provide information. And what would you think out of those 4 functions, refusing, request, socializing, seeking, providing information, what are the most common ones? What are the highest levels that you would see in our kids with visual impairments and multiple disabilities? Do you expect that they would have higher levels of refusing, requesting, socializing, or seeking, providing?
My opinion would be refusing.
And any thoughts on why?
That's probably their only really way of communicating on those 4 levels, is they do know how to refuse something by pushing it away or going against it.
Mm-hmm. That it's maybe just more common. Dawn, yeah.
I wonder if it is somewhat associated with a lot happening to them, and it is an opportunity that they have to interact. When someone is not doing something to them, then they may feel less that they have the ability to have an interaction or make something happen on their own.
I think it's so accurate that a lot of our kids have things done to them or for them as opposed to with them. And so a lot of their most common opportunities to communicate are about refusing or maybe requesting or expressing, comfort or discomfort about the things that are happening to them. I think, did I see April raise her hand?
It did. So I think definitely they're refusing also because unless they're being explained what's being done to them, given them, or what's happening, they can't see it. So it's kind of scary too until they actually understand what is happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's maybe more experiences that are happening that would warrant refusal or protest or discomfort, right? So you're right. Refusal and also requesting are the 2 most common, commonly higher functions for kids with visual impairments and multiple disabilities. And I believe that the reason for this, there's not a lot of research to say why, but I believe that the reason for this is because that's what they have experience with. And the reason that I think that strongly is that I met a student who really changed my perspective on this when I was visiting his school. A little boy who was totally blind, and I think he was 5 or so, and he didn't have any expressive symbolism on any level. He was mostly on the unconventional level across all these functions. So he couldn't conventionally say that he didn't want, he couldn't conventionally request or refuse, but social skills were way higher. He had several social communication gestures. He would wave hi and bye. He would orient toward a person, even though he was totally blind. He would, when you went to greet him, he would wave hi and then he would reach out his hand to shake your hand. So his levels of social communication were so much higher than his levels of refusal, requesting, and seeking, providing information. It's the first time I'd ever seen this. And so I was so surprised. I was like, wow, that's amazing that he has these higher levels of social communication. And I asked the team, what's going on with that? How did he get this amazing higher levels of social communication? And they told me that the child's parents, both of his parents, are pastors in a large community church, right? So what does he do on the weekends? What does he do every evening? What are the things that he has repeated experience with? Greeting people, right? So this, I think, is case in point that The reason that kids develop higher levels in each function is simply because of the experiences that they have. If we gave kids more experiences to be social, they would have higher social levels. If we gave them more experiences to refuse and request, they would have higher levels there. If we gave them more experiences with seeking and providing information, they would have higher levels in those functions. So that one really blew my mind and changed my perspective on things, and made me think too that, you know, a lot of our kids in segregated special ed settings, self-contained settings, they just don't have as many social experiences. So we have to create those opportunities so that they can grow in not just in levels, but in functions of communication. Also in the number of different people that they communicate with, the number of different routines that communication is happening, and then we're going to see the rate increase too. Are we okay if we take like 8 more minutes?
Yeah, because we started later.
Okay, cool. So because I just wanted to point out a couple of like the most poignant pre-symbolic forms of communication that you could kind of get started with right away even. A lot of what we talked about is all in the lens and with the approach of the communication matrix. And if you haven't heard of this, it is an assessment of expressive communication development that is appropriate for and totally normed based on kids with multiple disabilities, kids with visual impairments, kids with deaf blindness, kids with other sensory needs. And it's looking at expressive communication development in those levels that we talked about. It's very, very easy to use if you understand what we just talked about. So I think really going through those videos and getting a sense of what does pre-intentional look like, what does intentional look like, what does unconventional look like, and what does conventional look like, you're ready to give this a try if you haven't seen it already. The website, communicationmatrix.org, you can create a free profile. And I think with the free profile, it allows you to do like 5 assessments a year or something like that. If you are doing more than that, then I think there's like a paid version. But it's very user-friendly because it's just asking you questions about your student, and you're answering yes or no to those questions, and you're starting to point out what behaviors you see in each of those levels. And you're going to get a profile of your students' expressive communication to help you build goals for their development. Within your resources as well in the live binder is this poster. We call it a communication poster. We made it in New York a couple of years back because I think people were finding the language in the literature about this a little abstract. So we kind of broke it down. The reason it looks kind of small there is because we made it in order to print out like poster size to put on a classroom door, but you have a PDF, so you can just zoom in. So on the left side, you have a column that is the levels of communication development. The next column is examples of behaviors that occur at that level. And the next one is strategies that you would use if a student was on that level, and then a little section to write in things about your student. And what you're trying to figure out is where is your student expressively? Not what do they understand, but what are they doing in their expressive communication? All from the lens of visual impairment and multiple disabilities. We're looking at mastered levels. Those are behaviors that a student has all the time, is doing it across routines, consistently, and across communication partners. And then what are the emerging skills? Like I had a student who was starting to sign more, but she was only signing more for more drink. She wasn't yet signing more for anything else. So that's not yet mastered, but it's a great emerging skill. And then I know for her goal, the goal is generalizing it. It's not just going to be more drink. It's going to be more play, more music, more jump on the trampoline, and so on. Right? And across functions and partners. We've talked a lot about hand under hand. If you haven't read this article, Talking the Language of the Hands to the Hands by Barbara Miles, it is a really amazing and mind-changing foundational article on the way that we interact tactily with students and the role of hands in the development of language for kids with visual impairments. And it's amazing, important article looking at sort of stages of developing mutual communication with the hands. A lot of this stuff is just kind of here for you. I think we've talked through a lot of this. But what I wanted to talk about quickly as we wrap up is really the most concrete modality of communication for the students for whom, we're really on a pre-symbolic level and maybe even on a pre-intentional level. I found this to be super, super meaningful and a very easy thing to implement with the kids with the most complex multiple disabilities and visual impairments. And that is a touch cue. A touch cue is a very concrete touch on a specific place on a student's body, done consistently to convey meaning, to convey anticipation for something that's going to happen, to provide like an alert or a cue for something that's going to happen. So some examples of touch cues could be even in just greeting a student, a light touch on their shoulder, their back, the back of the hand. We're going to stand up or change our position. You might add a touch cue of just gentle pressure upwards to the elbow before repositioning a child. And if everyone working with the student always uses that same touch cue before repositioning them, you're probably going to see less stress and less, discomfort behavior in that transition, just like the video we saw. I like these two at the bottom because I think this is something that happens very frequently. You have someone come up to a student and say, "We're going to put on your glasses," and then without any other warning, the glasses come out and they're like on the student's face, and the student didn't get the anticipation that was going to happen, so they take their glasses off and throw them, right? Or they just feel stressed and alerted and discomforted. So instead, you still say, we're going to put your glasses on, or we're going to take your glasses off. Same thing with orthotics, shoes, socks, jacket, anything. But you also add a light touch on a place on the body that's near where the physical action is going to happen. And what we're doing over time is we're adding the most concrete form of early communication to start to build towards conventional gestures. Okay, and there's like a whole lot more that is mostly extension material. I want to say before I wrap up that where we're leaving off here, we're going to actually I'm going to include and pick up in the next session, especially as we talk about making routines functional for kids who are early or pre-language level communicators. And that's to say that those first 4 levels of communication that we talked about, the bridge between those levels and first words is this concrete symbol stage. And we used the example of the water bottle cap to represent water. There's a whole approach towards introducing concrete symbols to bridge the gap between conventional communication and language, right? A lot of our kids with visual impairments don't make that jump naturally, organically, and they need that scaffold or that bridge of concrete symbols. But an important thing to think about is that these concrete symbols are not an end goal. Our goal is not to develop a tangible symbol system, a concrete symbol system, and just have that be, that's it. That's the student's communication system. The purpose of these symbols is to develop symbolism and eventually expand into abstract symbols and language. So we'll talk about that a bit when we get into functional routines and integrating these communication practices into functional routines. And that's where we'll get into all this stuff on tangible symbol development, uses, levels of the use, and so on. I just want to say, well, for the handful of people who are alive, I'm totally open for questions, but if you're watching this as a recording, you can feel free to reach out to me at my email down there and ask any questions that you have. So any questions for you all who are present now?
This presentation was great, Chris. It was enlightening.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Thank you again to Tricia and Dawn, and to all of you for having me. Really happy to get a chance to collaborate and participate in this great conference.
Yes, thank you very much. I see so many things here that we have experienced, and it's like, oh, this is starting to make sense. So so now it makes it easier to take it to the next level. So as a parent, that's awesome. So
Oh, that's awesome, Debbie. I'm so glad to hear that. And do, of course, feel free to reach out if I can help at all with what the what the next steps actually look like. I'm happy to jump on a call or answer an email anytime.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I would say for all of you who are finding like, oh wow, okay, I think I have some good next steps here. I think one good next step that's pretty straightforward would be to just go and actually think of your student or child and go on the Communication Matrix website and see if you feel comfortable enough now to fill that out. And if questions come up there, then of course reach out too. But I think what you got tonight is like the background, the foundation of what you need to make sense of that assessment. And then the assessment results are going to get you some really, really great goals and next steps.
One of the things that was really just a wow aha moment with you speaking is those touch cues, because I've been promoting the verbalizing and then counting at least up to 3 so they can get their body ready. So for instance, if you're going to pick a child up, you let them know you're going to pick them up, and then you count 1, 2, 3 so they can get their body ready before you pick them up. And that touch cue would add so much more, even just to the respect of the child.
Yeah, I've found, and we just talked about it briefly. So, if that was like too quick of a run through on touch cues, there is a resource here that's also in your live binder about touch cues, where I've sort of broken down what is a touch cue, why would you use that with a student, and then tips for using touch cues. And then an actual example of an inventory of touch cues. And this was actually one that I made for a student in a hospital setting, but you would just adjust this to whatever is relevant to your student, your child. So you have, what is the meaning? What's the thing that you want to be able to communicate and you want the child to be able to anticipate over time? I like to start with picking things that are stressful for the child, but also picking something that might be interesting to the child, like exploration or, interacting with a sensory item or even just a greeting. And then what is the touch cue? What's the unique touch? And then maybe some little tips like this student has a significant processing delay, so we really need to add a little wait time. Keep the touch cue there and really count it out. 5 seconds is a long time when you count out loud. And then do the action. Then the second page of this is sort of like, a blank table to create your own inventory of touch cues for a student. I would always say, people always ask like how many. I would start with like 5 to 10, no more than 10, but I think 5 is usually pretty good start.
So Chris, do I have permission to share this information that you provided at the conference to those outside of the conference as well?
Absolutely, yeah. Please feel free to share any of it to anybody who would benefit. Yeah, and I always say too, if there's anything that you find useful here, please feel free to run with it. You can take it, you can make it your own. I really don't care if I'm cited or not, referenced or not. It's all yours, and if it's useful, adapt it to meet the needs of your student. And I would always love to collaborate with anybody who comes up with a new idea based on something that I shared. So go for it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.